Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppet coming at you with another APGov video. This time we're taking a look at topic 5.7, groups influencing policy outcomes. So previously we talked about what interest groups are, how they serve as a linkage institution, etc., etc. This time we're going to be taking a look at the various types of interest groups that exist out there. And when we look at interest groups, we can categorize them in many respects based on what their interests are. And the most common of these interest groups, based on interest, are those that have a certain economic interest. And that includes labor unions and interest groups that represent businesses and manufacturers. So first looking at labor unions, we've talked, in the past, in the 19th century, unions started to get their start in the United States. Early unions like the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, are going to have struggles being able to maintain their popularity. It won't be until the American Federation of Labor starts in the 1880s, founded by Samuel Gompers, that is going to start to have some real sustained success. The AFL is going to be a group that's going to be made up of skilled workers as opposed to all workers. They're going to be focusing in on the use of collective bargaining, strikes, not particularly political activism per se, but just the general sense of protecting pay, benefits for workers, not trying to overhaul the capitalist system per se. As we get into the first half of the 20th century, unions will get even more powerful. Probably, I would say, peaking around the 1950s or so, when the AFL will merge with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which will emerge as the most powerful unskilled labor union. And, by the 1950s, right after World War II, you're going to see that, close to 30% of all American workers will be in labor unions. So if you're talking about a third of the nation's, workers in some type of union, that's going to tell you that these unions will have tremendous political power. And the vast majority of that power is going to be directed towards the Democratic Party. Particularly in big cities in northern states, New York City, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, places like that. As we start to get into the 1960s, 1970s, we start to see unionization expand into the public sector. You start to see the beginning of police unions, firefighter unions, teacher unions, things like that. But at the same time that we're starting to see unions expand in the public sector, we're seeing labor unions in the private sector beginning to dwindle. As America starts to become part of the greater global, economic network, we're going to see the beginning of outsourcing of jobs to overseas countries, and with that, the decline of the power of labor unions. And they've pretty much been in free fall since the 1960s and 1970s. Today, only about 7% of workers now are in a labor union. And a big part of that is that fewer and fewer Americans are in manufacturing-based jobs. The vast majority of jobs are now in the service sector, the tech sector, which do not traditionally have union affiliations typically. So unions, which used to be a very, very powerful part of politics nationally, and that's not to say they don't have any influence today. They still do. They just don't nearly have the power they used to. Today, they are marginalized. Additionally, with regards to economic interests, you also have various trade associations, trade interest groups. Take a look at this. We're talking about over 90,000 different types of trade associations, interest groups, etc. Some of them are very big and broad-based, like the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Others are very tailored to a specific industry. It might be the grape industry. It might be the tire industry. It might be the shoe industry. So you can think of the industry. There's an interest group that represents it and lobbies on its behalf in Congress. Now, the granddaddy of them all is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As you can see, that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spends more money on lobbying and donations to candidates than any other interest group that exists. So if you're thinking that money equals power and influence, then there's no interest group that has more power and influence than the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And what's interesting about that is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, compared to most other interest groups, are not as partisan as many others. Now, they do tend to lean more to the right, more towards, Republicans, but they're not hardliners, not at all. Now, some other areas where we see interest groups pop up deal with social movements. When we see social movements go through American history, they tend to have a pretty big impact. For example, if you look back to the progressive era, the beginning of the 20th century, we see a social groundswell of, demanding more from our government in terms of helping the poor, clean up corruption, provide equal rights. You can see here the 16th, 17th, and 19th Amendments that brought about the federal income tax, direct election of U.S. senators, and universal suffrage for women, respectively. So understand that there are groups that exist to look out for folks that in many respects the government doesn't traditionally look out for. So mostly we're talking about minority groups when we talk about this. And these minority-based interest groups really have their foundation in grassroots activism. So in other words, voter registration, voter mobilization, protests, rather than big money cash donations. So the social movement interest groups don't nearly have the financial muscle as, say, economic-based interest groups, but historically still significant nonetheless. You've got, for example, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, existing to, for example, file lawsuits on behalf of, African Americans. For example, you don't have Brown versus Board of Education as a court case without the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You don't have the Montgomery bus boycott without the SCLC being led by Martin Luther King. You also have interest groups that represent women, the most famous of which is now the National Organization of Women, first founded by Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and a number of other feminists. They are also going to be using lawsuits, protests, direct lobbying of members of Congress to get some important achievements made. Title IX, as we talked about previously, equal educational opportunities regardless of gender. The Roe versus Wade ruling in 1973 is going to be significant because of money raised for legal fights by now. Now, note, some of these other social movements are not tied to the needs of minority groups, but in some respects, the needs of others. For example, the environmental movement is going to be an important part of what we would describe as social movements. And the environmental movement as a really organized thing in terms of trying to lobby government, trying to get new policies created. We really start to see that happen in the second half of the 20th century. A lot of it inspired by the work Silent Spring by this woman right here, Rachel Carson, which is going to be uncovering the horrible effects of the chemical DDT in food chains. And so, using that book as a way, kind of like an old school progressive muckraking book, you know what I mean? But when you add that to, grassroots interest group organizing and lobbying through groups like the Sierra Club and the John Muir Society and things like that, you're going to start to see legislation created in the 1960s and 70s that will exist to try to protect the environment. For example, in the 1970s, you saw the creation of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. You saw the Endangered Species Act be created in the early 1970s. You also saw in the early 1970s the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which exists to enforce many of these, environmentally based laws. Note, all of these things that I just mentioned, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, EPA creation, that was all done in the Nixon administration. Nixon as a Republican. A lot of folks forget about that. Also, keep in mind that during the Nixon administration, though this is not a governmental agency or legislation, to show you the impact of environmentalist groups, we see the creation in 1970 of Earth Day, which creates an annual recognition of the needs of trying to protect our climate, protect our environment. And of course, the more attention that Earth Day gets, the more attention environmental groups get. And of course, the more attention environmental groups get, the more likely they are to get policy created that is in their favor. Rounding out the 1970s into the 1980s, we also saw the creation of an important government agency known as Superfund. Superfund gets its origins from the tragic events that are going to take place, as you can see pictured here, at Love Canal outside of Buffalo, New York. In the 1970s, we found that a community, a suburban community, had been built upon what was a previous dump for hazardous chemicals, and the residents did not realize this until it was too late, when we started to see outrageously high cancer rates, leukemia rates, for many of the children in that community. Ultimately, the neighborhood was found to be too toxic to live safely in. Therefore, their entire neighborhood was condemned. Now, understand that, if you are living in a home that you've bought of your own and you've invested in, now that it's been deemed a hazardous waste site, good luck trying to sell that house. You have taken a total loss on it. And keep in mind, this is no fault of your own. You have been duped in terms of thinking that your land was safe, but in fact it was not. So you've got that issue. You've also, of course, got the issue of, trying to clean up the waste that is in there. You got to understand that many of these companies that are found liable for these hazardous waste dumps and accidents and all sorts of terrible things that exist out there, be it this or the BP oil spill 10 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, to the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska in the late 1980s. A lot of these companies can't afford to pay the fine, or they tie it up in litigation, or they go bankrupt in the case of Love Canal or whatever, and the help needs to be done immediately. So Superfund exists to be able to have money set aside to help offset the costs of these environmental disaster cleanups, which unfortunately happen more common than we would like. To round out taking a look at social group movements, you also have certain interest groups that exist to protect consumers. We mentioned previously about Ralph Nader and him being probably America's most well-known consumer advocate, and his publishing of the work Unsafe at Any Speed, talking about the dangers of the manufacturing of the Chevy Corvair. So anyhow, consumer movements in some respects get their origin from the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. You might remember Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, for example. But note, modern consumer activists and consumer-based interest groups have been responsible for a number of protective measures. For example, requiring that car manufacturers have seatbelts put into their cars. And now, of course, every state mandating that you have to wear a seatbelt in your cars. We also have, more recently during the Obama administration, the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This was designed to try to protect consumers from shady, unethical practices of credit card companies that would make it very, very easy for people to sign up and qualify for a credit card, rack up a whole bunch of debt on it, and the consumer, the buyer, the user of the credit card not really be mindful of the effects of it. So in other words, you might be on a college campus as a freshman, you show up, you're excited, and you see somebody, at the quad saying, "Hey, sign up for this credit card. We'll give you a free t-shirt or a free pizza or whatever." And of course you go, "Oh, hey, that sounds good. Free food or a free shirt or whatever. Sure, sign me up for the credit card." You don't read the fine print. You don't realize the high interest rates. You don't understand that a credit card can easily put you into a cycle of debt that you can never really get out of, short of declaring personal bankruptcy, which is a nightmare for you in life. Now you've got the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that exists to put more rules on it. So, for example, credit card companies have to make it very, very easily known in bold type what the interest rates are, what are the penalties in terms of not paying your balance off every month, etc., etc., etc. So keep in mind, you've got some interest groups that are looking to protect business owners, some to protect unions, some to protect ethnic minorities, some to protect the environment, some to protect consumers. So once again, if you can think of the group, there's probably an interest group that represents them. Okay? We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.